the European leaders are trying to pull out of Afghanistan, and we see what the French president is trying to do. How do you think that will affect the NATO operations in Afghanistan and maybe the alliance of NATO in general?
Well, from a point of view of a military planner, of course, they're not going to be very happy about that. They rely on these commitments made by NATO partners. On the other hand, from my point of view, it might accelerate the push for a diplomatic/political solution to the situation in Afghanistan. We have been trying for the last decade to solve the problem of Afghanistan militarily, and it hasn't been solved. That's not to say that it's going to be easy to solve the problem diplomatically or politically or economically, but we haven't really invested the time, the energy, the money into that side of the equation to try to find some stability, some political stability in Afghanistan. That's going to be the real charge over the next couple of years. My hope is that the withdrawal of French troops, Dutch troops, Canadian, Australian troops, that will actually lift the diplomatic solutions higher on the agenda of the United States and its partners.
But many might argue that it's not the NATO's responsibility to boost the economy of Afghanistan, especially at this time.
It isn't NATO's responsibility. Of course, NATO is responsible for ensuring an overall security for the country within which there can be economic growth, within which there can be political stability. NATO, of course, has been involved in things that go beyond, strictly speaking, its military capacities, in part because NATO realizes that if you look around after the end of the Cold War, there aren't a lot of military missions to be engaged in. And so NATO has, perforce, looked at other possible operations, whether it's delivery of aid or it's dealing with crisis situations, natural disasters, etc., environmental situations. So NATO has been looking at that, but right now, at least for Afghanistan, the focus has been on the military. But what I'd like to see with the reduction of NATO's forces in Afghanistan, I'd like to see the other actors in the situation to step up to the plate. And not just the United States and NATO, but it really has to be a regional solution. We have to involve Pakistan. Russia should be at the table. There should be discussions with Iran and with India as well. I mean, this is a regional problem. All of these countries have had interests and continue to have interests in Afghanistan. They should also be playing a role in trying to find some kind of solution.
But 10 years after the presence of NATO in Afghanistan, I mean, it didn't seem to improve. Many might even argue that the Taliban and Al-Qaida problems are even greater now than they were 10 years ago. How do you think they can balance this and the economic stability at the same time?
Yeah. Well, I would say that the situation for Al-Qaida has definitely not improved. Al-Qaida numbers very few at this point in Afghanistan. Some more in Pakistan, but not overall a huge presence. I mean, whatever presence Al-Qaida has, it's largely not in that region any longer. I mean, it's shifted to Yemen, to other parts of the world. Taliban, yes, of course, the Taliban has basically responded by either going into hibernation at times of greater NATO bombing and attacks, or when NATO retreats a little bit, it goes on the offensive. But the Taliban has both its military and its political side. We have had, and we've been trying from Washington to engage the Taliban, to set up a kind of negotiating office for the Taliban. Those are continuing apace. It's not going to be easy.
And it hasn't been successful. I mean,
so far it has not been.
Pakistan, you talk a lot about the involvement of Pakistan, agreement between the U.S. and the NATO alliance with Pakistan over their supply route to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
How do you see that affect the operations in Afghanistan?
Well, from a military point of view, of course, the supply lines are very important. It's cheaper to go through Pakistan. In many cases, it's safer. And so having Pakistan on our side is critically important. But at the same time, we have to look at why Pakistan, closed down those operations. Pakistani government felt that our kind of violating its sovereignty on any number of occasions, not just violating sovereignty, but actually killing Pakistani soldiers, mistakenly, but whatever, They weren't happy with that, and they continue not to be happy with that. So if we're going to have Pakistan as an ally, we have to seriously address their concerns about sovereignty issues. I think if we have a larger kind of discussion, a regional discussion that involves Pakistan as an autonomous actor, that goes somewhat toward their goal of being taken seriously as a sovereign state and as a sovereign state with interests in the region.
Many question, what strategic benefit does this system has to the U.S. and maybe Europe even?
Yeah. Well, it's tough to talk about capabilities when it comes to missile defense because as a system, it hasn't been the most successful system that we've put forward from a military point of view. It consistently fails in terms of its tests, has cost overruns. There have been several recent reports from the GAO, from various academic institutions, calling into question the entire system. Nevertheless, Europe has committed, several countries, of course, Turkey has committed, Poland, Italy, to at least have some role to play in this defense system, if only a radar capability. NATO is scrambling to kind of find the money for this because it's going to be an extraordinarily expensive system, and the Europeans have only ponied up a small portion of that. And, you know, at a time when the United States is desperately looking for ways to cut military as much as $500 billion minimum over the next 10 years, it's going to be tough to find support both here in the United States and in Europe for a much more robust missile defense system. So I think NATO is trying to put the best possible face on what is still a contentious issue. And that's not even taking into account Russia's opposition to missile defense.
And the scientists you were referring to even said that they should scrap key parts of the whole system. But there is complaints that this system doesn't even protect the U.S. It rather protects Europe.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of systems that we have in place that have dubious, feasibility, a dubious value. I mean, just look at the tactical nuclear weapons we maintain still in Europe. If you look at the range at which those nuclear weapons would strike, I mean, they only would strike within Europe itself. I mean, barely might Kaliningrad. It might touch Kaliningrad, and that's it. Why do we keep them there? They have no military utility whatsoever. We keep them there for outdated Cold War reasons. Why do we maintain a missile defense system? Well, in part because of the Cold War legacy. We started this program in the Cold War. We still have this idea that somehow it will protect the United States and Western Europe from a much larger missile threat. But the specific missile threat from this is Iran. And right now, Iran doesn't have a capability to reach Europe in any reasonable or sensible way. So the missile defense system is really, it's of dubious value right now. And I think that's why it's difficult to get buy-in for it from our European allies. They have a lot of things they have to spend money on. And to think decades down the line when such a system would be both feasible, maybe, and usable, maybe, and useful, maybe, is a big commitment.
It's a hypothetical system. Russia opposes the system.
Yes. I mean, Russia's been invited to participate. If I were Russia, I would say, look, I don't want to spend my money on this, but that's another question.
So how do you think this will affect the relations between Russia and NATO in the future, and maybe the U.S. even? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think missile defense is an unnecessary kind of provocation, shall we say, for Russia, as NATO expansion has been in the past. We've, of course, reached out, NATO has reached out to Russia to sit down, to talk, to have agreements. But for the most part, this has been seen by Russia as just kind of superficial. What I think Russia wants is to be taken seriously in any kind of security discussions, across Eurasia. Of course, Russia has set up its own security discussions with Central Asian countries, with China, and so forth. I think that it would be useful for NATO and the United States to say, look, we are now in negotiations with Iran about its nuclear program. Let's continue those negotiations, expand those negotiations to address missile questions as well, and deal with the missile issue that way, and not spend so much money on missile defense, which is of dubious feasibility to begin with, and start to address the range of issues that the United States and NATO have with Russia about a variety of different security threats, which are serious and affect the entire world, whether we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about non-state actors and terrorism, or we're talking about non-proliferation. These are serious issues that we have to be sitting down and talking about. NATO is an institution that has to find some kind of legitimacy 20 years after the end of the Cold War. It developed a kind of, shall we say, interim reason for being, to go after rogue states, so to speak, to deal with the crisis in former Yugoslavia, more recently to deal with Libya, potentially to deal with Syria. But that really goes beyond what NATO was designed to do, which was collective security for Europe specifically. I personally think that the recent summit was an attempt again. They tried it 2 years ago in Lisbon to find some kind of rationale to keep NATO going, to keep a reason for spending so much money on this alliance. And I don't think they found one.
It seems very hard to find one. Thank you very much, Sayed John Feffer.